to the final session this afternoon, and the final session of After the Archive, which is very sad. And I have great pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Sillence. He's a lecturer in humanities for graduate education and training at UEA. He's worked for the Library and Student Support Office in the Sainsbury Research Unit for the Arts of Africa, Oceania and the Americas following the completion of his PhD in the School of World Art Studies and Museology in 2009, also at UEA. And he's going to be speaking to us this afternoon about old material and new media. And you'll find on the tables an evaluation form for the programme, which would be very grateful if you took a few moments to fill in at some point during this session, and we'll collect them on the way out afterwards. So, to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand over here because the microphone over here, and we're streaming this live today. So, and it just occurred to me that I didn't have time to sort of change the type of my presentation, because it sounds like I'm just rehashing something I did ages ago. Old material, new media. I'm just streaming stuff I've done 1,000 times before. No, I haven't actually. This is a presentation that's very new to me, and I just, by way of a disclaimer, I guess, I'm not a digital humanities expert. I am very much a novice in what I'm going to keep referring to as DH, or digital humanities, and I've learned a tremendous amount over the last 2 days. I'm sure we all feel the same. It's been a remarkable event, and I just want to formally thank all of our organisers for doing a tremendous job in pulling this together and getting the workshop leaders and the participants and speakers together. Yesterday, when I was talking to some of the participants as well, we were talking about when the best time to do a presentation was, and apparently doing a presentation in the evening means that people go fairly easy on you. So, whereas doing it in the morning, they're more critical. So, but you know, that's fine. That's all right. I think I maybe got the easy task today. But so what I'm going to do in terms of the format of this presentation is I'm going to talk at you for about half an hour or so with the PowerPoint presentation. And then what I'd like to do is to actually run through some of the key points from the last 2 days, because it's been a really intriguing journey, I think, and it would be nice to try and summarise some of the main sessions that we've had, and also to open out the discussion at that point, really, to think about the value of this project and how you found it, because in front of you, as Steph says, there are evaluation forms, but I'm sure it would be great for us all to have a think about what we've got out of the programme in the last couple of days, and how we're going to move forward from here. So I'd love to hear some of your suggestions. I'm sure our organisers will as well. So without further ado, I'll give you an overview of the 3 bits I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. So this presentation is in 3 parts. The first considers the notion of professionalism in relation to institutional and individual curation and dissemination of archival materials, and how these practices have tended to be mutually reinforcing. The second is based on something called post-custodialism. And if you're researchers in the arts and humanities, if you stick post before something, it sounds impressive, so I thought I'd stick that one in there today to make us all feel kind of a bit more like we're doing arts and humanities. So this is a relatively recent move, actually, by institutions towards mobilising online communities for information curation activities. And those could be things such as cataloguing, they could be transcription of materials, and even interpretation, and I'll come on to that in a short while. The third and final part here outlines 3 major challenges, and I like that word, challenges. I was using it earlier. You don't say problems, you don't say problems in the arts and humanities now, you say challenges, okay? So, and this is really concerns the sort of new information landscape that we've got, which we're still kind of feeling our way around. And these 3 areas are trying to understand, I guess, the wider skill set that you need to negotiate these challenges, combining the competencies from archivists and academics to reflect on our own research projects, and I'll come on to those towards the end in a bit more detail. So the first one, professionalism. Well, archives, or more broadly, as I'm going to call them, memory institutions. This is I've been trying to find the definition of this term, but it could be museums, libraries, archives, those which are caring for our information or our shared cultural heritage. They've traditionally employed information professionals to survey, assess, and catalogue the archival materials in their care. Now, aside from the preservation of materials for the future, such institutions have also aimed, of course, to improve public awareness of and facilitate access to their collections. Institutions are also able to deploy staff to work on projects specific to their collections for particular purposes. And some of these projects are supported by injections of funding and therefore have certain outputs in the form of, say, online catalogues or digitised material. And we've talked quite a lot in this second day about those. Now, as a user of archives, the researcher contributes to or generates his or her own survey and recording of materials within the specific remit of the project. This is typically, in the case of many of us here, a doctoral project with a very specific output, a synthesis of sources brought to bear on a research question. Now, higher education sector funding can also support much larger projects, funding a small team of researchers with slightly different research outputs, so not, for example, part of the formal examination process. Now, the distinction I'm drawing here is not one of sort of non-HEI or higher education institutions and HEI entities, because a university library itself inevitably runs its own projects, and we'll come on to those shortly, but rather the kind of professional distinctions that have been in the sector, so service-based versus academic. And many academic projects using archives place great value on the identification of materials and their organisation, but often see this as a service that they've either have provided for them or provide for other scholars, while placing much greater value on the research questions that they generate out of these data. So it could be argued that academic projects have different aims than those of archives themselves, so they are interpretative rather than descriptive. Now, the outputs themselves tend to conform to certain models, a catalogue, a database, and inevitably, when it comes to publications, journal articles or monographs as scholarly outputs. These are all cultural artefacts in themselves that reinforce the professional standards of the archives and the university. A very useful question raised in yesterday's discussion, I thought, concerned the extent to which source materials and research findings are truly accessible to the wider public. After all, many archival materials are still behind closed doors, and some collections may only be known by a relatively small group of researchers. So on to my second point. These are the sort of main areas I've just talked about, but on to my next point of post-custodianism, I guess. I will define that now for you. Institutional approaches to information management have largely been profession-based. So structures of formal training, professional discourse, public accountability have long reinforced the need for skilled employees to serve as custodians of the nation's collective archival heritage. And it was very interesting when I was looking at some of the recent digital humanities discourse on the history of archives, of how much we still refer back to Hilary Jenkinson's 1922 Manual for Archive Administration, which is available as a PDF online, rather ironically. It's out there as a PDF on archive.org. Download it, have a read through, and look at the way that the archive was considered in the early 1920s. It's very different to our approach today. Now, these same institutions, strangely enough, have actually been very quick to respond to changes in government policy and to concurrent developments in technology. The creation of what I'm going to call here digital surrogates, that is the kind of copies or photographs of materials, have not only been perceived as a form of preservation of the originals that inevitably degrade, they have a materiality, but also as a means of transcending the barrier of physical access. Digital surrogacy also leads potentially to multiplicity, the ability of the image or the text, whatever object it is, to be visible and subject to interrogation simultaneously by virtually anyone with access to the internet, a form of decentralisation similar to that defined and predicted by F. Gerald Ham back in 1981. Now, Ham's quite an interesting case here because this was a sort of the inception of this term post-custodianism. It's sort of re-emerged now with digital humanities discourse as well. So these are some of the things I'm trying to reinforce with digital surrogacy, this idea that we digitise the content that we have there, creating those copies, enabling that instant and simultaneous access. The sense of decentralisation is becoming distributed widely, and this move from the materiality to the kind of immaterial. Now, the electronic record is a crucial part of post-custodialism. Britain's archives already share records online as consortia, allowing users to search for descriptions of collections in their care from a single interface. The National Archives already offers this service through its Access to Archives scheme, so you can go online through the National Archives and have a look at what other record offices hold in their collections around the country. And they aggregate this content from the local record offices as well as its own holdings. The National Archives has even started to allow access to digital surrogates as downloadable files, but they're available for a fee. And I had a look last night, I was scrolling through, and they boast very well that 5% of their collections are being digitised in different forms. But I did notice that there was a kind of paywall, which is a small fee attached to what you can actually download. So there is, in a sense, there's a sense of access and moving towards a much more widespread digitalisation of access, but there still is a cost involved in that. You can, of course, see the originals for free if you go in. Now, the British Library has an extensive sound archive, and this is free to stream over the internet. And I know that some of you have been talking about film and other forms of media today, and this is something that increasingly we're finding more and more that sound as objects are accessible to different groups as well. Now, there's various reasons for developing these digital surrogates, one of which is to reduce human contact with materials that are at risk from further damage. Another is a way of increasing access to already well-used materials. In an era of widespread internet usage within academia, instantaneous access to digital surrogates is ever more desirable for research activities. This panoptic utopia, however, is far more complex than it first appears, and we'll return to some of the problems associated with this approach in the final part of the presentation. Now, post-custodialism marks a significant shift in thinking for academic communities. Although the presentation of materials changed and access from professionals and non-professionals could be increased, the production of digital records and digital surrogates often remained in the control of institutions, still performing roles as gatekeepers to information. And social media has had a considerable impact on that kind of model. One of the most important points noted by Kate Teamer in 2011 has been that striving for objectivity, which was a residual tenet of Hilary Jenkinson's 1922 Manual on Archive Administration, has been replaced by the idea of transparency. So there's a shift from the objectivity concept to transparency. Now, postmodernist interventions have long questioned the notions of an objective archivist and a neutral archive. And Web 2.0 tools allow institutions to interact with their users, to record their activities and methodology in a way that has never really happened before. Although transparency still implies a physical barrier, when I talk about things being transparent, the glass in that window over there, we can look through, but we don't necessarily move through into that area. Changes now started to be made with information management. The gate can, it seems at times, remain open as tasks formerly performed by information professionals, such as transcription, move to an online community. And this form of outsourcing to an online community, or the crowd, has been dubbed crowdsourcing. It's probably a term that you've seen in the news. Following the inception of the term by Jeff Howe in Wired magazine in 2006, But it's been developed by a very recent position publication on the phenomenon by Darren C. Brabham, who suggests that a much narrower definition should be established. But for the purposes of this paper, what I'm going to do is stick with Brabham's what he calls the key ingredients. So the first is an organisation that has a task it needs performed. The second, a community or crowd that's willing to perform the task voluntarily. It's quite crucial. The third, an online environment that allows the work to take place and the community to interact with that organisation. And fourth, a mutual benefit for the organisation and the community. Now, one particularly successful initiative is University College London's Transcribe Bentham project. A part of the ongoing Bentham project at UCL, this web-based initiative, funded initially by the AHRC, enabled web users to contribute to the transcription of 10,000 handwritten folios of the philosopher and social reformer Jeremy Bentham. It was launched in 2010 and employed a wiki environment in which users could see the digitised image of the manuscript and enter their own transcription using a transcription toolbar, and that was designed to record as many of the conventional and also the unconventional aspects of the text as possible. This was then moderated by a member of the project team and can either be approved and then locked down or held open for editing if there's any particular problems with it. Now, a vastly increased volunteer workforce also goes some way to easing resource pressures, particularly those associated with reductions in public funding, allowing work to continue on collections that would otherwise have been postponed. And this was a concern that was raised in yesterday's discussions about the momentum of archival projects. When we actually start doing something, is there a means of continuing it? Crowdsourcing requires some degree of supervision and moderation, as the work is typically undertaken by enthusiastic amateurs and not professionals. But as long as the task or tasks performed are clear, they're not complex, institutions, it's argued, stand to gain not only from this distributed workforce, but also from the so-called wisdom of crowds, a phrase coined by James Surabiki to describe the phenomenon of crowds for people basically outperforming experts, so large groups of people able to outperform some of the best people in certain sectors. Now it's the diversity of this group that's actually the collective strength, and this is particularly key when brought to bear on solving problems and seeking innovation. And I was just explaining to Josh a little bit earlier how I was at a talk a few weeks ago by a global R&D director of a major pharmaceutical company, and they're using a model quite similar to this called open innovation, which is basically moving it away from their own institutional capacity and their own in-house experts to a much more global network of researchers, people who are looking at things from different angles and different approaches to drive forward their own innovation. Now, some institutions have taken this one step further and have embraced the concept of the wisdom of crowds, not to solve problems, but to problematize. And it always makes me smirk very slightly. I was at another Chase event a few weeks ago where somebody put this a lot more succinctly and eloquently than I'm going to do, but he said that scientists will always seek solutions to problems, and those in the arts and humanities will always seek problems to the solutions. So it kind of, in some ways, can work both ways, but it seems to be filtering through for different sectors. So it's long been recognised that memory institutions are not neutral repositories of knowledge, but tend to project themselves as given, as natural, timeless. And scholars in the arts and humanities often seek to destabilise and question these institutional narratives, but rarely offer suggestions as to how they might facilitate multiple narratives through their users. Museums have long relied on visitor feedback to improve their services, permanent and temporary exhibitions, but they're also reflecting on their own tendencies to produce institutional narratives. A project called Curator, and we've got the link on screen, it's well worth a look, uses QR codes and relying on widespread smartphone ownership and in-house tablets. They use a series of iPads They tackle this by allowing the visitors to contribute responses to questions posed by the museum about the objects that they have on display. The crowd, therefore, is not just a resource for outsourcing a workload, it's an attempt to widen the interpretation, which under traditional models tends to be limited to institutional discourse, be that service-based or academic. And on the website you can have a look at the kinds of responses they've had from their user base at 2 different locations, and how they've gone about filtering out things that are not relevant to the questions that they've been asked. There was about 20%, interestingly enough, where people were putting comments that had absolutely nothing to do with the museum collection, so I don't know exactly what they were doing while they were walking around, but that kind of usage is interesting, I suppose, in trying to understand how people are using information, in this case, objects. So, the final bit, challenges rather than problems. In this presentation, I've concentrated on institutional practices and initiatives, and those both mentioned have been UCL-based. But the questions for today's researchers and those of tomorrow concern their place in this transitional environment. And so for example, what is the individual's connection with the crowd, and should there be any at all where archival materials are concerned? Recent publications on crowdsourcing activities have tended to blur distinctions and explain the role of social media in the research process as a way of harnessing the crowd. An example might be how an academic might establish his or her own blog, and then how the blog is used to record their research activities and their findings, share them online with the digital abyss, and then largely through serendipity, and in case, I remember when I did this a couple of years ago, you might find someone who's slightly interested in the research that you're doing. But you're hoping to engage a community. Now, this interaction might be one way. It might be simply a diary of what the academic does. But it could also be two-way. So the blog users might suggest lines of inquiry, unknown resources, or sources of help. Research projects are more focused, and if the academic is familiar with and using and customizing a wiki, he or she might build this into the project, allowing users to tackle specific tasks, effectively contributing to the research process. Here we approach something like the institutional projects I've already mentioned, but there are some serious challenges for the individual to bear in mind. Now, one of the first ones for me was this notion of authorship, and the work of the individual in the arts and humanities, and that's rightly or wrongly, has been valued more highly than the work of a team. That's what it's always seemed to me when I've compared across different disciplines. And this is largely due to the way that research is organised, funded, and in many cases examined in HEIs. It is much easier to determine the contribution made if there's only one contributor. You can identify that individual. But is it really that straightforward? Acknowledgement of previous scholarship and support for research projects already takes place, albeit relegated to the marginalia of the thesis or publication. But would not a more overt acknowledgement of support go some way to reminding us that no scholar is an island? And this touches on an issue explored yesterday by Philip Houghton from the HRC. Although models of examination and promotion within HEIs may continue to operate on the basis of the individual candidate or the individual employee, models of funding, in particular public funding, might be made to value public engagement as part of the research process rather than as simply an extension of the research output. So this is one of the things I'm going to try to get across, is that we seem to be at a tipping point now where researchers are coming in, or even before they're going on to do doctoral research, thinking about this issue of how they're engaging with communities or empowering communities. And we saw some very good examples of how the HRC has funded work in those areas. But as doctoral candidates and as career researchers, that might be something that we want to try and encourage as well in future generations. Now, the second challenge concerns ownership and copyright, and I was frantically altering my presentation earlier this morning when Naomi Court was doing a much more effective and professional approach to this, so I apologise as my second disclaimer that anything I'm saying does not quite tie in with the correct definitions of these terms. But as we've seen over the course of these 2 days, archival materials are normally in the care of an identifiable body, an organisation or an individual. The researcher may access these materials, but they cannot utilise them publicly without first seeking some level of support or permission from the copyright holder. And we've seen how that sense of copyright can be a sort of tether that moves through, even though the physical objects may still be traced back. At an individual level, engagement with the crowd is therefore potentially risky because you're putting material out there and you may not be certain where it came from or where the copyright holders are today and whether there's permission for it to be used. Researchers have a duty to refrain from disseminating and publishing materials when permission has not been granted. He or she may have a particular research angle which may be important, but it might not match institutional priorities, strategy, or even policy. A gender conflict can only be resolved if the individual and the institution have some form of contract or memorandum of understanding that sets out the framework in which the researcher can operate and harness the power of the crowd for mutual benefit. It's perhaps not surprising that the early projects, the ones I've just talked about, that employed crowdsourcing came from within university collections. The Transcribe Bentham project, for instance, did. Where the academic staff already had access to those collections and the copyright was much clearer. It's clear from these issues that crowdsourcing must take place within a network of stakeholders who are required to make certain agreements with each other. Moreover, the shift in HEI funding towards partnerships and consortia, as witnessed by the recent establishment of doctoral training centres and doctoral training partnerships by the AHRC, suggests that institutions, HEI and non-HEI, and individual researchers need to be clear about their roles and responsibilities if they're to work together effectively. Now, my final point is something that actually only struck me about a year ago when I was doing a training session with a colleague who deals with an image archive. And this is one challenge that I wanted to flag up because it's actually omnipresent, but it's rarely actually examined by people. And that's the fragility of digital information. Many institutions and academics writing grant applications, indeed most of us, will place some degree of faith on in digital information. Where we leave our holiday photographs on a CD or a DVD perhaps, we may be under the impression this is a form of personal archiving, caring for, preserving such images. But the life of the medium itself can be extremely short. Milad Douay has recently challenged the assumptions that digital is the saviour of memory institutions, be they government departments or otherwise. When it comes to our interaction with digital surrogates, we begin to treat them as material objects, but they are little more than receptacles for the immaterial, the actual data effectively that's on them. Now, the US National Archives and Records Administration, I had a look online last night just to sort of figure this one out. How long does a CD or DVD last? Right, okay, I've got a drawer full of stuff with my PhD research on that. I thought, oh, that's nicely put away for future generations to discover, when they find my skeleton, they will find all these discs next to it. Okay. But here we are, a quote from the US National Archives and Records Administration. They state that the CD or DVD experiential life expectancy is 2 to 5 years, even though published life expectancies are often cited as 10 years, 25 years or longer. They then go on to say a little bit about usage and how whether it's writable or rewritable.